maybe I'll start, but just making a comment really. Because I think when we think about, I mean, it was great hearing you giving us like this comprehensive overview of Brazilian art's presence in the UK. And I can't help to think, like, in the late 80s, early 90s, when I was still a student, I mean, although there were some very important monographic exhibitions of people like Oiticica and Lydia Clark that traveled to many institutions in the US and in Europe, and I think contributed a lot to the promotion of Brazilian art abroad. There was also, especially like in the early 90s with the celebrations of the 500 years of the discovery of the Americas, there seemed to be lots of like lines of funding, and they were directed to exhibitions around this idea of Latin America. So Brazil tended to be shown within this Latin American context. And you also mentioned that big exhibition that Don Alice curated here, and so it was sort of around the same time, a little bit before that.
That was 89.
Yeah, but like very close to the actual year of the celebrations, which was 92. Yeah, and I think this has changed a lot. I mean, like, whereas at that time, maybe we can switch on.
It is turning off, you just need to leave it.
I think it has, gradually changed, and I think there were some important points in this trajectory. I think probably one of the first ones being the 24th edition of the São Paulo Biennial, curated by Paulo Herkenhoff, which was the first edition that was actually where the curatorial premise was entirely based on a body of knowledge that was totally Brazilian. I remember the previous edition was around the idea of dematerialization of art, which, by then was kind of a very old idea already. And then there was the edition of the Panorama da Arte Brasileira, curated by Adriana Pedrosa, which kind of, in a way, inverted that equation, because and the Panorama is a biennial exhibition that takes place at the Museum of Modern Art in São Paulo, and it's supposed to be a kind of overview of what's going on in Brazilian art, a bit like the British art show. Yeah. But what Pedrosa did, and Pedrosa had worked with Herkenhoff as a co-curator of the 24th Biennial in '98. He showed only the work of foreign artists that make reference to Brazilian artists. Like, there were quite a lot of Latin Americans, but his point was to prove that Brazil had ceased to be kind of incorporating foreign influences and transforming it into something Brazilian, like in line with the Manifesto Antropófago, the Anthropófagos Manifest of Oswald de Andrade, which was what inspired Herkenhoff's exhibition, to become kind of a cultural influence to foreign nations. And but still, like when we think about these major museums today, and going back to the idea of like lines of funding, we still have separate committees, acquisition committees. So, as you're saying, like Latin American art still enters the permanent collection through these specific committees.
Yeah.
And the exhibition that's actually on show at the South London Gallery now was specifically commissioned as an acquisitions project. So all the works there were purchased by the Guggenheim through kind of Latin America committee, not committee, but like it's a specific project.
An initiative.
Yeah. So I was wondering, I don't know, like this was more like a general commentary, but.
No, I find that quite. I think it's quite interesting how it's brought in a regionally specific way, not only Latin America but also other regionally named committees. There are a lot now pretty much all the bases are covered in terms of countries that it previously didn't collect and how it's shown. So they're not really allowed to show it as Latin American art. They have to show it as kind of an expanded version of internationalism, but at the same time they're buying it as Latin American art. And it is a bit contradictory, and it's a little bit frustrating. I think that lack of just being kind of like, well, let's just call it what it is, which I find more appealing. And in a way, the Under the Same Sun project as an exhibition that's very explicitly about acquisition for the Guggenheim, the fact that that's kind of openly acknowledged makes it more critical and makes it more reflexive. It doesn't remove every single problem about kind of suddenly rushing to buy Latin American art and the effect that that might be having on local collections and local market. I mean, I'm sure there's other wider issues, but I tend to favour the project that's transparent rather than the one that tries to mask things and talks about internationalism, where actually, when you look at the mechanism, something else is happening. And I think it would be kind of fun if places like Tate played with that a bit more and were a bit more kind of open about what's public knowledge anyway.
I mean, I was surprised to learn yesterday. I was asking Alexandre because I saw the work that was purchased by the Tate actually at the exhibition display at Tate Brittany. So I kind of assumed that it was purchased through, I don't know, another kind of line of funding that they had.
Yeah.
And then he told me no, so it was through the Latin American Acquisitions Committee. And I wonder, I mean, like, do you think it would make a difference if there was no, I mean, I'm sure these committees are necessary to fundraise for.
Perhaps I think it's a question of not being able to, not being resolved properly between the market and the public institution. So the public institution's responsibility to show internationalism or to show work that isn't sort of geographically specific in order to avoid any possibility of falling into ideas of exoticism or even foreign, or the idea of the emerging, which I think theoretically we're all trying to avoid, a center periphery, all of these debates that keep kind of floating, and we're all sort of disagreeing with them, rightly so, and you know, looking for a language that defines it. But the market operates in a very different system, in a different way than the critical debates. And I think what you just highlighted was exactly that, this sort of, I don't know if it's a tension, but certainly this sort of parallel way in which these two things work. One, that it's about creating a context for art to be seen for what it is, rather than being art first, rather than being Latin American first, or African first, or European first. And the reality that if you're finding some ways to raise the money for it, then you are, for better or for worse, finding people that have a particular interest in that region, whether because they come from there, whether because they relate to it, or whatever. So I think that's the situation now. It's actually the tension, I don't know what better word to find, between market and collecting for a public institution with a public responsibility at a time where we're really sort of questioning ideas of who's at the center of what, and where does the periphery, you know, who's the center, who's the periphery, and how it works. So I don't know, I think it's the lack of resolution, perhaps, rather than tension, between these two forces that create this possible contradiction, or lack of transparency. Well, it's interesting in the relation to PIPA, because PIPA is made up by you know, a public institution working with collectors and investors.
Yeah.
I mean, this is really.
That's what we try to differentiate, because it's actually, the institute is completely separate. It is funded by a hedge fund, but it's completely independent from tax benefits, government incentives, so it is run independently. And we try to emphasize that too. And that's the whole point in trying to denominate the basic. We try to get people from outside of Brazil to have this vision of the inside. because you're saying it's fine. Like sometimes they nominate artists who at some like they are already established in our eyes for Brazilians, but for foreigners maybe they aren't. So there's always this contradiction.
But it's influencing collecting because
Yeah.
actually an artist then donates whoever's chosen
Yeah.
is being collected and by a Brazilian institution.
That's what I was thinking when you were introducing the prize. Is it has an interesting relationship to the museum. So
Yeah.
the way to create a really strong national collection through a prize. It's kind of it's important to have those strategies
Yeah, of
for public
course.
museums then.
There are ways of reconciling the fact that public institutions don't have a lot of money and the money's somewhere else.
Yeah, I was
And how do
actually
you bring it in?
going to ask you about gasworks, for instance, because with the
Yes.
international residencies, you obviously depend on very different lines of funding, and so let's say it may be difficult to bring an artist, I don't know, from Peru or like a country that doesn't have as many resources as other countries. It can provide a scholarship, a grant or like a residency grant. And I remember in one of our discussions of the Sheila Wakely Residency Prize, we have here the winner of the residency, who's from the Dominican Republic. But I think this is something that has a weight in the decision, like the fact that this is a residence that was established here in the UK in the memory of Sheila Wakely, who was a British artist who had lots of ties to Latin America. But then I think you think very strategically about that. I mean, I think you're great. And
What do you mean in the way in the selection?
in a way, like when you think about a Latin American residency, it may be much easier to get funding, specifically, let's say, from Mexican or Argentinian or Brazilian artists than it would be
For an artist from the Dominican Republic. for
Exactly.
instance, yeah.
or
Yeah.
Peru
Or Peru.
Bolivia. I don't know.
Yeah, Bolivia. I mean, there are definitely, we had 18 artists from Brazil over the last 15 years, and we haven't had any Bolivian. And it's not because there are no good artists in Bolivia. It's because of resources, and because of the politics, and because of an interest at national level or certainly local level to create these exchanges. It's both a combination of funding, but it's also of values, the understanding that these links are important for the artists and beyond. That when Pipa does this, when the Ibere Camargo does this, when Itaú Cultural did that, which is a bank in Brazil, they organized this residency. It wasn't just because they just love art, it's because they see culture as a way of creating connections that are bigger than the artist himself or herself. Bigger than gasworks, bigger than So it's all part of a greater conversation about the role of the role of culture within a social development, investment, and all of these things. So when the way residencies work at Gasworks is that we try as much as possible to establish long-term partnerships with funders that either have an interest in a specific region or country, or come from that country, or collectors from that country, etc. But that it's not always possible. So when we do have the Sheila Wakely Fund, or when we used to work with Train, which is a university based at Chelsea, it's a program within Chelsea University of the Arts, then it's an opportunity for us to kind of go beyond the usual, perhaps, not the usual, but the most, what's the word I'm looking for? I'm really not finding the word, it's Friday afternoon. But, where the connections are very, more possible. So we try and go outside of that and look who we think would not have any other opportunity. And that's where we bring in artists from countries like Peru, or in the past we had artists from Paraguay, or but from Ghana. You know, let's not just be within Latin America. From Ghana, from Kenya now, and all of these things, which is fundamental for Gasworks, because we're trying to also not just follow the economic routes that have been opened by banking and international trade. We have a history of actually trying to widen the idea of international, so that when you think about art in Latin America, you're not just thinking of Mexico and Brazil, but you're also thinking of the Dominican Republic and Colombia and Peru, and then you go outside of that. So it's being strategic. It's being strategic with what's available in order to. I guess it's a little bit what Tate does with the purchasing things. It's finding where you can find the money, but then you present it in a way that this is art from around the world, and you try and sort of classify it as little as possible, so that it's the art and the artist that you were talking, rather than you creating a very tight, prescribed space where the artist is like forced to operate. So representing Brazil or representing the Dominican Republic. No, you're representing yourself or representing an entire sort of region. Of course, you're part of a context, but it's about not burdening that artist or that practice with having to kind of represent the Dominican Republic in the 2016. You know, I think that would be, we would all fail if we were to do that. Yeah.
And often with those kind of residency funding, there needs to be this kind of fixed outcome for a show or a piece that goes into a collection. Have you had difficulty kind of protecting that fluidity? Is that how do you see that?
Yeah, I hope I'm not making this up, but I think it's getting less and less difficult actually. And I think it's because there's an understanding now of the role of these open-ended projects like residencies that wasn't there before. I think almost the sort of the weight of the market and the sort of the strength of the product and the value of it, but also the expanding number of collectors and people that are interested in art is also created an understanding of a greater ecology. You know, like places like Gasworks, Tate didn't even know we existed 15 years ago, because Tate thought that they were the center of the world and they didn't need anybody. Now they come to our shows because there's a much sort of the links between various spaces and the role that we all have has become more apparent. I think that the art world has also become a lot more sophisticated in the way they think. You know, you don't go to discover new talents at Tate, but you come to Gasworks, and if you're a collector who's emerging, or not emerging collector, but like somebody who's starting, maybe you're more likely to come to Gasworks than going to Tate, you know, because you could meet somebody who's just starting off, and maybe you're more likely to be able to purchase that or not. Do you know what I mean? So I think there's a greater understanding of the ecology, the ecological chain that links us all. And we've also learned through doing it how to describe our activities more. So even though the residency is open-ended, it has a series of events, of markers that gives it a rhythm, that create visibility for the artist. So we have an open studio, 25th June, everybody, 12 till 6. Talks, presentations, artists may do events that marketing, social media, all of these things have become much easier. Smaller organizations that we could have never afforded to put, say, a big advert in Freeze about the open studios, because there's hundreds of pounds for that ad, and we'd rather give that money to the artist, but we can tweet about it. So there are ways of disseminating our activities that are much more cost effective and that have connected us much more quickly and to our public and the artists to the public. And I think this has created also a new space and a new understanding of activity. So that fluidity is being seen part of somebody being interested in art, is being seen part of what you do to go and see it. I mean, I'm surprised that that there are a lot of collectors tours that come to Gasworks to do studio visits and stuff. That certainly didn't happen, and it's happening now. I think it's happening more and more, and of course we welcome it, because I think it's also very nice to be able to establish a discussion, or certainly a potential conversation between artists and the public, or the collecting public, or the curators, while the work is in process rather than at the end. So the idea that actually that conversation can affect the way things progress is actually quite exciting, and can have a genuine impact. Because once it's done, it's done. You either like it or you don't, sort of thing. But
there was a long way, you know, like, a lot of difference, like when you're showing the Gambiana exhibition, and you're saying, oh, this was so new for the circuit, and but then these days people feel very comfortable, I guess, like going to you know, open studios with a Chinese or Korean, Brazilian, Dominican.
Yeah. No, things have really changed a lot. I mean, certainly in the context of London, I think there's a sort of a greater understanding that we're all part of the same narrative, but that you can approach that narrative in all these different levels.
And for you, I mean, because of course, like your work is it's much more kind of in depth, you know, like it's actually, you know, like a research that investigates the specifics of different, you know. And how has this changed in this sort of like internationalization of the art circuit? Has it affected the way you work, or has it given you more opportunities, or
It's a good question, actually, because I think that in some ways it's like it has the opposite effect on me. Because in the beginning, when I went to the University of Essex and I did an MA that was in Latin American art, and I found it really problematic, and I didn't want it to be called Latin American art, and I didn't want anything to be called by its nationality, and I wanted everything to be related, and I was very interested in networks, I was interested in signals, and it feels like the more that's become accepted, the more I feel like I'm going the other way. Maybe that's just because I'm like that. But it is a problem, because the trouble is, I think, if you looked at everything only in terms of the things that manage to get connections, it's a bit like you wanting to include more people within the network of Gasworks, then there's a lot that gets kind of left out. So I tend to be, primarily more interested in what people are researching within the Portuguese language than what people are writing about in English, because that is always the things that get kind of very repeated. Yeah, so that's, in terms of being, you know, an academic or a researcher or publishing things, for me as a kind of principle, it's very important to do it kind of, it sounds very like a diplomatic term, but to do it kind of bilaterally, so that you are having a conversation with research in that country, and kind of trying to help knowledge about Brazilian art and the history of Brazilian art, which is still very kind of in the process of being written for certain periods of time.
And I think something that we were commenting yesterday, and probably not everyone agreed with me, but what something that I've always noticed here, like when writing about contemporary Brazilian artists, lots of international critics, they always read the works through the key of neo-concretism, because this became a kind of, a well-known point of reference, let's say, obviously a very important point of reference, but that cannot be like just one common denominator for all the contemporary art that's being made today. So, and I guess your work it goes in it goes in also in this direction of uncovering and researching and writing the history of all those other art histories that are not very much known.
And I think that particularly when that history gets translated to English, trying to say that process needs to be a bit more slow and a bit more patient, because you can't say this is the history of Brazilian art in the 70s, because actually that was such a complicated period of time politically that it affected how art history was produced and how archives were produced. So you can't just say, okay, I've got this book coming out in English, I've done the history of Brazilian art in the 70s. So no, actually no, because there's a lot that you don't know. And I think that's really fundamental, because otherwise you can really create blocks, and that happens a lot, because the question of language in what I do a lot of the time, being kind of writing and reading, you do realise how many blocks that creates, and obviously in some ways producing art or curating exhibitions has a bit of more of an advantage, because not everything is based on language, so there's a bit more fluidity. But when it's about kind of producing knowledge, then the sort of ethics or politics of whether you translate or not, whether you give credit to the person who's done this research in Brazil before you have, all of this becomes kind of important to think about, actually.
Yeah, it seems to, today it seems to me that there's a certain kind of imbalance in the way that institutions and the market have evolved in terms of showing contemporary art, and the type of knowledge that has reached an international audience. So.
Yeah.
Do we have any questions from the audience? So I guess we can wrap it up. Don't forget to take your free poster, and right at the entrance it's rolled up. And thank you very much again for coming, and thanks to all speakers.